Hello, Phil. Welcome. I'm excited to talk to you about 1945, The Reckoning.
Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to join you and talk about it. I've got my Australian bar all set up in your honour. Ingredients for a Negroni, which we had last night.
Oh, yes. Well, look, it just makes me want to have a drink. It's not fair.
Well,
Anyway.
It's a bit early for me, even for Mrs. Craig.
Yes, it's right on cocktail time for me, so it's rather tempting. My mouth is watering. I wanted to tell you my reaction to your book, and I loved it. And the reason why I loved it was I think you told us in a really clever way the role that empire played in 1945. But what I loved was you let us get to know people that were actually there, and that made us really care about it. And the book is so truthful, yet it's not damning, it's not judgy. There's an undercurrent of real understanding there. And I thought, how many edits would it take to achieve that sort of balance?
I think my TV background helps. I've spent 40 years making TV shows as well as writing the books that I've written. And that's all about compression and editing and being prepared to throw things away. Because the first drafts of this book were much too long and there were many more people in it. So I did do a lot of rather brutal editing. And you sit there thinking, well, that's a month's work I've just put in the bin. But actually you need to be that tough on yourself, I think, when you're writing a book like this, or the readers will get lost because there's a lot going on. I wanted to have 5 or 6 strong characters that would help take people through. Anybody who's made a TV show or written a popular book would tell you nothing really grips like a human emotion, whether that's an interview or just somebody's testimony. If you engage people with a real human being that they begin to care about, that gives you the space to sprinkle in your analysis, the bigger political, economic, strategic details that you need, but you don't want to lead with them, you want to lead with people. I mean, that's how I write my books anyway. So. Yeah. But thank you. I'm glad you didn't think the empire stuff was too heavy-handed. I didn't want to duck it, because it's such a big conversation in our world, especially since Black Lives Matters. How do we really treat our history? Which statues should we pull down? Which should we leave up? And I thought that, especially when you're looking at the end of the war, when there's a certain amount of darkness in the story, a certain amount of backsliding from the British, especially, maybe also the Australians, from some of the promises. I had to deal with it, but I didn't want to swamp it. I didn't want to write an angry polemic, and I hope I haven't.
No, you haven't. That doesn't come through at all, and that's why it's so readable. The political forces at play, particularly near the end of the war, that really gobsmacked me. I wasn't aware of it. Did you know what you were looking for? Did you know that was your big moment, or did it surprise you as well?
I thought I knew a lot about the Second World War, and I'd written 2 books before this, and I'd made countless documentaries about it. And I didn't know about the Far East. I really didn't know, for example, that we put the French back into power in Vietnam, despite the fact that the Americans had promised Ho Chi Minh he was going to take the country over, despite the fact that Ho Chi Minh had been our ally in the final months. We put the French back into power and basically set the scene for 30 more years of carnage, which would cause millions of deaths, would of course draw America and Australia into another war. And all of that was perhaps unnecessary. And it was caused by a thing I tried to grapple with and understand. And in the end, I fell upon this phrase, imperial muscle memory, in Paris and in London, that created that dynamic. And these sort of things happened in several countries in the final months of 1945, after the end of the war, actually, in the sort of October, November, December. And I was really surprised. I didn't know. And I think I've asked audiences this when I've spoken. Only about 1% put their hands up to say they knew about this stuff. So, yeah, that was a surprise to me. And I think because it doesn't sit with the way we like to remember the war. We want to think of ourselves as the heroic underdog, especially here in Britain. And there's much that is heroic, and I'm not gainsaying that. But some of the things that I discovered and put in the book don't sit very comfortably with that form of remembrance. And, I like my history, warts and all. And that's what this book is.
Well, that's because you don't like your history sort of curated to fit a narrative. You want it to be what it really was, and that's what this book does achieve. That theme of broken promises, was so impactful because it was almost too much a recurring theme, wasn't it? Like you say, particularly through near the end of the war, and that was such a bad thing that happened in Vietnam because it was the sort of old-fashioned equivalent of now the CIA. What were they called?
We called it OSS.
Yes, and they were there and they were working so closely with him and Ho Chi Minh, and they just really shafted him. And it was down to de Gaulle and Churchill deciding that the French wanted Vietnam back. Do you think they had any sort of prick of consciousness when they made that move?
Roosevelt's death is a very important moment in the story of colonialism. He was very against colonialism. He had earlier kind of strong-armed Churchill into making various promises about India, for example. And he was absolutely certain he never wanted the French back in their empire in what we call the Far East, Southeast Asia. But he dies. Truman doesn't care as much. And something else is happening. America is itself backsliding from some of the promises it makes, because America is becoming a sort of empire itself. It's massively expanded its power. It's got this huge navy. It's clearly going to dominate the future of the planet. And they're not very keen to give territory back to some of the people that they've just liberated, even though their own promises imply that they should. So when it comes to Vietnam, yeah, the French and the British want to put the French back. Ho Chi Minh believes he has a promise from America that he will take over because the OSS guys can see he's really popular and he wants to be friends. They actually draft the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence with him. It's written by Americans.
Yes.
The first paragraph of it is a quote from America's own Declaration of Independence. This is an extraordinary thing. And 20, 30 years later, when the Vietnam War is raging, all these memos are found in Washington and the big front page news. And people are saying, hang on a minute, our own government thought that he should be in charge. So what's going on? And the answer is that Truman took his eye off the ball. The British and the French crept back in very quickly, created just such a bad atmosphere that there was never going to be peace, and set the region up for many more years of carnage, which of course would involve Australians. And would tear Australian society apart to an extent.
It was so impactful, the fact that the Vietnam War didn't have to happen if they just had have actually followed through on their promises. Now, of course, it's a really dramatic story of the book, how they actually achieve this, because they achieve it by releasing Japanese prisoners of war.
This is a really shocking story. And it also explains why the atmosphere was so poisoned. Don't forget, Ho Chi Minh and his guerrillas have been fighting with the Americans against the Japanese. And suddenly, here are the British. They get into a fight themselves with Ho Chi Minh. They're short of men. And so they release all these Japanese prisoners and they arm them and they sent them into battle. And this is happening in the final months of 1945. What's in all the newspapers of the world? Accounts of the horrors that are being revealed of what the Japanese have been doing to prisoners, to people in their germ warfare labs, to civilians, to all the people on the death railways. We've all seen the films and read the books. The world was stunned at the violence and the cruelty of what the Japanese army had done. And yet here are tens of thousands of men who would have done those crimes, some of them, serving under British officers. It happens in the Dutch East Indies too. At one point, Mountbatten flies into Jakarta, where there's a similar thing happening. They're trying to put the Dutch back in charge with Japanese troops. And he's driving from the airport, and there are thousands of Japanese soldiers saluting him with rifles. And he's like, didn't we just fight a war against these chaps?
Yeah.
And it really is dark. And, people say, the French like to say, Albion perfide, the British are all terrible liars and cheats. Well, you can sort of understand it when these things happen. Promises are broken, old agendas emerge. This is the way of the world. De Gaulle especially, he was so humiliated by France being occupied. He wanted his empire back. He wanted the glory, and he wanted the income from the colonies, of course.
Yeah. I was just so shocked that really they were prepared to go that far to actually achieve their aims. It just was really, really shocking. It sort of reminded me too of the Afghan translators and interpreters when America pulled out and they were left sort of to the mercy of the Taliban. It just seems to me that should anyone ever believe the promises of war?
I mean, it's very hard. In Burma, which I write about a lot, there's a guerrilla action. A local tribe helps the British a lot, and they're made promises, and they're all broken.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that, but I'm going to go back because we've skipped ahead a little bit because I want to talk about the British Indian Army and General or Colonel Timmy. Did he become Colonel Timmy? I think he did.
General Timmy.
Yeah, General Timmy. So believer in independence, very loyal to the British Indian Army, and what an incredibly difficult position he was in. And he did have his doubts sometimes, didn't he?
Yeah, I really wanted to tell the story of India because if empire is governing everybody's thoughts and behavior, which it is, India is central to this. India's gone through decades of agitation for independence. Young men like Timmy, he's called Kodandira Subaya Thimaya, and I WhatsApp with his grandson, which is
I wasn't going to attempt it.
But he's known as Timmy, and he's a nationalist. He knows the Nehru family. You know, Nehru will become prime minister. He does believe in independence, but he also is a soldier. He's got a lot of loyalty to the army. His own brother and his uncle are in the army. And the Indian Army is a wonderful institution, and it does amazing things. But there's another Indian Army run by a man called Bose, called the Indian National Army, and they side with the Japanese and indeed with the Nazis because they think that's the best way to get independence. And men like Timmy are very torn. Timmy's own brother deserts. Well, he's taken prisoner and then he joins Bose. So there's a chance Timmy will have to fight his own brother, and they're really close. That just shows you how divided people were. But I think in the end, he didn't trust the Japanese. He didn't want Indian independence to be built from Japanese bayonets, especially when he saw the way they behaved. The people that they were conquering, because in a way they were an empire every bit, so often worse than the British. So he thought the best way was to win this war, to create a new kind of infrastructure that would deliver security for this new independent nation. And in the end, I think he was right. And although it's quite funny, and I do go into this a little bit in the book, in modern India, including Prime Minister Modi, who was always talking about this, it's Bose, the man who makes the deal with Hitler and the Japanese, it's Bose who is held up as the great hero of independence. Because he never, he was always committed to getting the British out. It didn't matter what deals he did with what devils. And Timmy, who I think did more, really, is kind of forgotten.
You know, that your book did debunk that. And I'm just wondering, have you had much of a reaction from India? Because you tell the true story of Bose.
Well, I've had some criticism online. I mean, Bose has lots of young fans and they're very active online. But I was thrilled. I've had 5 or 6 reviews in the Indian press, very positive. And a lot of them saying the same thing, that, we need to realize that the Indian Army was heroic and victorious, and there would have been no independence without those victories that they delivered. The fact that they were under British control is kind of secondary. And Bose himself, he was charismatic. He was very, very intelligent. Before the war, you'd have put him down as a future leader, but he sort of falls for the glamour of the dictators. I write about this, in the 30s, people like Stalin and Hitler are actually quite popular because they're men who get things done, and they have paramilitary armies and they have parades and banners and burning torches. And I think Bose was really into that. And I think he's a messianic figure, a dangerous figure. And I think it's a bit of a shame that as the years go by, in the age of social media and TikTok, it's kind of easy to fall for someone like that. But if you live in the times that they live in, as Timmy did, it's a harder decision. And I'm sure, from my perspective, Timmy made the right one.
Also, you say in the book that General Timmy thought that the best way to independence also was to have a strong army. And he believed that the best way to achieve that was sticking and with that, and then having that strong basis. Bose, when he was a mouthy student, you tell us about this, and he was arrested for railing against the sanctimonious hypocrisy of Gandhiism. And he was released in a form of house arrest, you say, in an old family compound. So he was obviously from a rather well-to-do family. And he manages to organise his escape and go to Berlin. And that itself just kicks off this amazing story you tell of 1941 and 1942. Tell us a little bit about that, who he encountered. He arrived in Berlin. What happened?
Well, Bose becomes one of the most famous men in the world. He escapes from house arrest. He travels across India. He gets across the border into Afghanistan, all sorts of disguises. I mean, it's kind of a heroic story. You can see why he's hero worshipped by many people today. This is just before the Germans and the Soviets go to war, so they're still allies. So the Soviets actually get him to Moscow, then they fly him to Berlin. He's put up in a beautiful home. He's allowed to live openly with his wife, even though because he's Indian and his wife's Austrian. And that breaks all of Hitler's racial laws. But, they don't care.
Yeah.
He's called Excellency. He's invited to parties. He hangs out with Goebbels and Himmler. He meets Hitler. He meets two men who are the architects of the Holocaust. And he goes to concentration camps with one of them. So he knows what's going on. And he is challenged. He has quite a left-wing background. And some of his old comrades challenge him about what he's doing. This is in 41, 42, when it's clear that things are happening in the East, in Poland and in Russia, that are terrible, that the Holocaust is beginning. And he settles on this form of words, which his supporters today will still use. If you're doing a good thing in a bad world, and he thinks he is, independence for India, it's a good thing. If you're doing a good thing in a bad world, it doesn't matter who you ally yourself with. And quotes, what the Germans may or may not be doing in the East is not our concern. We need the help of these men. That's what he believed. It's still argued about in universities and amongst journalists and TV people in India today. Is Indian independence enough to justify complicity with the Holocaust? I don't know. He did.
Yeah, he comes across as quite a weak character to me, someone that doesn't have the courage of his convictions, because he was very, he loved the Soviets. And then when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, you say that he pretty much said, oh well. He didn't.
It's that old cliche, my enemy's enemy is my friend. His enemy was Britain.
Yeah.
So who is the most powerful force standing against Britain? Well, it was Stalin and Hitler. And then suddenly it's just Hitler. But, most smart people at that time probably thought Germany would win. This is before America's in the war.
Yeah.
So in that period, he probably thought he was just being pragmatic.
On the right side.
And in the new world, dominated by the likes of Hitler, he could speak for India and run India as an ally of the Nazis. I mean, that was his dream at that point. And it seems awful now, doesn't it? It seems very cynical. He would have said pragmatic. And his supporters today still do. And he has many supporters. It's quite astonishing. You mentioned, do I get stick? Online, you'll get hundreds of people. And they'll say, we mentioned Timmy. They'll say, well, Timmy was a mercenary. He was a licked little mercenary of the British. He kissed the feet of our oppressors, whereas Bose was a strong man who always stood by his principles. That's the debate.
Right. Well, it could be argued that if it wasn't for General Timmy, they wouldn't have had an India. But anyway,
well, I would agree with that. I would agree with that. But
yeah. So he travels to Japan on a submarine.
Yeah.
And look, this book, I've got to just cut in. I've got to tell people, you got to get this book and you've got to take time to read it, because there's so many beautiful little nuggets like this. So he goes to Japan on a submarine, which makes him very sort of swashbuckling and everything. And he goes to Nanking, and he's basically just used for propaganda there. Tell us what happens in Nanking.
Okay, well, anybody who knew anything about the 30s and the awful war the Japanese had fought against the Chinese knows about Nanking. I mean, Nanking is probably one of the all-time great atrocities. I'm not going to go into details on this podcast. It is just one of the most extended periods of kind of sadism and cruelty the world has ever seen. The Japanese slaughter tens of thousands of people, and not just in the moments of victory, the hot blood of taking a city. This is over 2 months of sustained horror. And it's called, I won't use the word, it begins with R, of Nanking. That's what it's called, because there's a very, very awful element of women and children and girls being killed. Anyway, it's a terrible thing. Everybody knows it's a terrible thing. It's very famous. Books have been written about it in the late 30s. So when Bose finally makes his way to Japan, he's put in charge of this Indian National Army. And he supercharges it because, like I say, he's charismatic. He's very good at organizing things, and he builds up this force. And the Japanese use him to go to all the places that they're currently running, places like Malaya and Burma and Thailand, to speak about the benefits of allying with Japan. And they have this thing called Asia for the Asians. We're going to build a new Asia, get rid of all these Europeans. We'll run it under the protection of the Japanese military, and you'll all be much freer than you were. See, it was always quite cynical. The Japanese were also oppressing these people, but never mind. As part of this tour, he goes to Nanking. And in Nanking, he makes a speech about this very thing, Pan-Asian values, Asians caring for other Asians, and that we're different from Europeans. We're not rapacious. We're not imperialists. And to make that speech in that city where one lot of Asians had performed such cruelty to another shows such a kind of cognitive dissonance, I think the phrase would be, the psychiatrist would use, as to kind of boggle the brain. But I think, again, like with the Nazis, he's so far into his alliance, he can't pull back. They even take him to the Andaman Islands, the only bit of India that they conquer, a small chain of islands. He makes a speech. It's celebrated today in the Indian media every anniversary. He raises the flag of a free India. Within a week of him leaving, the Japanese execute 40 of his own supporters. Because kind of that's what they're like. But so, yes, he is a puppet of the Japanese. And in the end, his army kind of fails in battle because the Japanese don't really respect him or them enough to give them decent weapons and supplies. But yet, as I say, in modern India, just recently there was a 10-part Amazon Prime series all about Bose and his army, and it's beautifully made. It's very expensive. It's extremely emotionally manipulative, and it's mostly not true, but it's very popular. Has anybody made a show about Timmy, the real Indian army? 2.5 million volunteers who beat Bose, who beat the Japanese. No, they have not.
And
it's annoying like that.
That's so important. That's why this book is so important. I think it should be sort of really compulsory reading in schools. Because, the curation of history, this is just a classic example of that. The story that is currently being told is sort of has political aims rather than truth. Angela Noblet, is it Noblet or Noblet?
I think it's Noblet.
Noblet. I fell in love with her. She was
Northern England.
I think it is Noblet. You'd know more than me though, but she was such a lovely contrast in the book because she was such a good person, but she was realistic. She had her little quirks and she seemed to be very honest, and she was just a character throughout the book that I didn't want her to fall from grace because I thought she was wonderful. And was that a very conscious effort to use her for the goodness, or did you just stumble upon her diaries and think, well, this is brilliant?
I'm glad we're talking about Angela, partly because this is a woman I love. Because I think I've fallen in love with her a little bit, even though we never met.
I can see you,
her spirit,
Angela.
Yeah,
but she's like your lovely wife anyway, I would imagine.
Yeah, yes, she is. Francis didn't give me permission to have this kind of relationship beyond the grave. But
yes.
And I've met her daughter and Carol and various other members of her family who love the book too, which gives me a lot of pleasure. But no, Angela was a nurse. She has very modern ideas for her time. I talked about imperial muscle memory in politics. She's not like that. She really does believe in a future of, fairness and equality in the world. So she's rather idealistic. She has the most extraordinary story. She travels to India, She serves in hospitals. There's love, there's loss. She gets engaged. She breaks up, gets engaged again. She has love affairs. She sees suffering. She's courage. She treats people from all different armies, including Japanese prisoners. And she's just there at important moments. I mean, for example, I wanted to include the Bengal famine because it really does affect the way Indians think about independence. And it's a terrible thing. You can't ignore it. And I found a great way of getting into that through her because she witnesses it, because she travels through lands where famine is gripping the communities. And I came up, she'd written this diary up for the Imperial War Museum in the early 80s. And I was looking for somebody to talk about the medical side of the war. Yeah. And I couldn't believe it when I found it, because I thought, wow, this is an amazing character. Because it's also, I've made the book so far sound quite like it's full of heavy analysis and it's very political. I mean, there are bits that are, but there's also, I wanted it to have human beings at the heart of it. And she's such a great example of that. And there's some beautiful moments that, really grab you around the heart of where she sees the world.
She ended up in West Bengal. A nursing trip struck down with malaria, and heat stroke. And there's a quote which really got me, and I'll just quickly say, it's just a few sentences. From a mixture of newspaper accounts and army gossip, the nurses soon learned that Japanese soldiers were raping and murdering women as they swept through Asia, and that the red crosses on their uniforms would offer them no protection. And when I read that, I just nearly died, because I thought, oh no, she's going to get killed. And I didn't want to read on. And I won't tell you what happens. Obviously she didn't, because she wrote her diaries in the 1980s. So you've already given that away. But seriously though, where did she find the courage? And where did other people like her find the courage? Because there she was, fully aware that she could, this could befall her. And we like to think that if we were in the same position, we like to think that we'd be courageous. But when I read your book, I wonder whether I really would be. Where does this come from?
Well, this is something I've thought about for many years. I was lucky enough to meet many members of that generation. This book is the third in a trilogy that I started in 2000. In those days, you could socialize with veterans. In this house at a party in that garden behind those curtains, where I had Spitfire aces, people who'd worked for Churchill, survivors of Dunkirk. I got to introduce to my kids. It was amazing. Wow. I think the one thing that distinguished all of them was a very quiet form of courage that they explained as duty. They didn't want to let their friends, their families, their country down. That seems to motivate a lot of them, that this is just something that they feel they have to do. I think as we get older and more distance from that period, it's perhaps hard for us to think, could the modern generation summon up those reserves? Although, to be fair, in the 1930s, people had said the same about them.
Really?
We could never stand a war like with the Great War. Well, they did. I think also they had a sense that this was a particularly important war because, and this is what Angela would have said, it genuinely was a war for a better future. And the propaganda, which starts with, I guess, the Battle of Britain, is that this is no longer a war just for God and King. It's about democracy. It's about change. It's about building a better world. And we don't always deliver on that, and there's a backsliding which I talk about in the book. But it did still motivate a lot of them, Angela especially. She really did have a sense of a kinder, fairer, more decent world. And actually, Allied propaganda, which all of them read, in pamphlets, did speak about a world beyond empires, even though it wasn't always delivered exactly as perhaps they would have hoped. So yeah, they were idealistic, they were brave, and they had a sense of duty. And they didn't want to let their friends down. Courage, making your friends proud is a big motivating factor, I think, to a lot of these people.
Right. I want to talk about Douglas Peterkin because we're talking about heroes, and he was very definitely a hero of the book. So for those that don't know, for a bit of context, he was one of the first men that liberated Belsen concentration camp. And when they got there, 40 to 50,000 desperately ill people were there needing their help. And it was the sort of help they needed was just overwhelming. And Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Johnson, who became the senior medical officer at the camp, wrote a letter to his wife. And I've just got a few sentences because I found it so impactful. He said, "I've seen things which I could not have believed possible. Darling, it's too horrible to describe. I've never really hated the Germans till now." And you could just tell how much that took him to say that. "Now I can't believe they belong to the same species as you and I." And you could just sense this man, this decent, brave man with Douglas Peterkin, driven to write that to his wife, trying to get across to her the enormity of what they've discovered. And we've all seen pictures from Belsen, you know, the horrible, huge pit with dead bodies that they have to bury as quickly as they can because typhus is ripping through. They did a wonderful thing. They created a human laundry to save as many as they could. And I'd like you to tell people what that was.
Well, yes, as you say, those images from Belsen, they really fix the Holocaust in the imagination of the world.
Yeah.
You know, lorry loads of corpses and people being bulldozed into pits. The story that's less well known, which I really wanted to tell, was the amazing medical innovation that saved tens of thousands of lives. And the small group of British doctors come upon this unprecedented horror. None of them, this is in the final days of the war, they're all looking forward to going home at this point. And suddenly they have to kind of improvise something to deal with this. And they are absolutely brilliant. They work day and night. They pull in medical volunteers, students from all colleges in Britain. They get some Americans to come as well. All these people know, by the way, they're probably going to get typhus, and most of them do. Douglas Peterkin does, because it's hard not to get it. And that's a very dangerous disease to have. But they're dealing with starvation, with typhus, with other diseases. And they improvise. They create this thing called the human laundry, where they bring people into a sort of barracks, they strip them, they burn their clothes, they hose pipe them, they clean them, they douse them with DDT, anti-louse powder, give them clean clothes. They improvise new food supplements because they can't eat normal food. Normal food will kill you at that stage. And they do all this in about 10 days, and they save so many lives. And it's very powerful. And, you know, I make some criticisms of British policy in this book. But you know what? Maybe the fact that Britain was an empire and could pull all these resources together allows things like that to happen. Puts someone like Peterkin into that situation where he can do incredible good. And can I read one little section?
I would love you to.
Very short section. Because I just thought, I found this rather moving. The long and detailed equipment lists for 11 light field ambulance never contained quantities of lipstick or face powder. But Douglas Peterkin and his commander Mervyn Gonin soon discovered that such things could be lifesavers too. Quotes, "A very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things, and I don't know who asked for the lipstick. I wish today so much that I could discover who it was, for it was the action of sheer, unadulterated genius. I believe nothing did more for these internees than that lipstick. I saw women laying in bed with no sheets on them, but with scarlet red lips. I saw one wandering around the barracks with a blanket over her shoulders and scarlet red lips. It was as if someone had at last done something to make them feel they were more than the numbers tattooed on their arms, that they were individuals again." Isn't that amazing?
It was.
That's what these guys did.
Yeah.
And it's one of the highlights, I think, of the book, and a key moment in 1945. And I think, you know, needs to be balanced against some of the negative things that I say about what the British do. But the other thing that's so touching to me is that this man, Douglas Peterkin, touched my own family. And in a sense, he's the reason I wrote the book. Because like any decent husband, I do what my mother-in-law tells me, or else. And my mother-in-law, Jennifer, who viewers of my podcast might know a little bit about, she lives around the corner. Her husband, who died during COVID, his life was saved by this man just after the war. And he had been talked about in our family as a heroic doctor who dealt with this polio epidemic in 1947 in this little town in Devon. So I wanted to put him in just because I wanted to write about, post-war Britain a little bit. And I had no idea. None of us had any idea until I started looking him up online. I said, well, he's won this award. He's written this thesis. Oh my God. He was not only in Belsen, he was one of the absolute leading doctors in Belsen.
Yeah. That moment, when you discovered that, it almost would have seemed too good to be true and like you were meant to write this book. Did you feel like you were sort of double checking, is it the same guy? Have I got the same doctor?
It was a magical moment, actually. I have to say, through my career in telly and writing, telling stories, it was one of those thrilling moments I'll always remember. Yeah. And it got even better because I was actually able to meet somebody whose life he did save in Belsen.
Yes.
And introduce that person to my mother-in-law.
Eddie Boaz.
That's right. He's Australian now.
Yeah. Well, tell the story about that, because Douglas Peterkin was walking along the street. He just had typhus, and I think he was away from the camp but recovering. And he's walking along the street, and he sees this little boy who is Eddie Boaz. So you tell what happens.
Well, yes. So Peterkin, the war's now over. Peterkin is recuperating from his own typhus, and Germany is full of refugees. And there were some people sent from Belsen on what's called the lost train. And this is, if it was possibly even more horrific than Belsen, this probably was. They're put on a train. They're supposed to be sent somewhere else. The train breaks down. They're locked in their carriages. I think a third of them die. Eddie survives, but he has typhus, as does all the other members of his family. And he ends up begging on the streets of Leipzig. And that's where Peterkin is. He's not in uniform. He's not on active service. He doesn't have to do anything. But he sees this boy. He recognizes the problem. He says, where are you staying? It takes him to meet the rest of his family. And he sorts them out hospital beds, clothes, proper treatment, and eventually personally organizes them to go back to their homes in Holland. They're one of the very few Jewish families that survived from Holland. It's an amazing story. And Eddie'd written about it. I found out his book. I met him in Sydney, which was another amazing moment. And then when he was in London 2 years ago, I introduced him to Jennifer. And it was weird because there's two people, both whose lives were dramatically changed by the same man. I mean, one is a massively important story, the Holocaust, and one is a very tiny story in a little village in Devon that only really affects me because it's the reason I have a wife. It's the reason France exists.
Yeah.
But somehow, we write history and we read history to connect the past to the present, I think. I think that's why we do it.
Yes.
It was just a magical moment. It was so nice to meet. And actually, I took Jennifer down to Devon, to the village, a few weeks ago to do a talk. And so many people who remembered her and Tony as children came along. They all remembered Peterkin. In fact, some of his former colleagues came.
Wow.
So
that's amazing. And there was such a moving moment in the book too, when you say that your father-in-law, Tony, saw a letter in the paper. And it was Peterkin, and I can't forget, he wasn't happy about something, I think, that he was writing into the paper. But back in those days, they had addresses when they wrote their letter to the editor. And Tony wrote a letter to him to thank him, saying, I'm the little boy you saved from polio. And he got a letter back, did he?
Yeah, so moving. It was. It's just, I think this was about 2007. And Tony was by then probably in his 70s. And they got the Dawlish Gazette delivered still. And yes, in those days, they still printed people's names and addresses, but they don't now. And he wrote them and they got a letter back saying he remembered the case and he remembered Jennifer and Jennifer's family as well and wished them well. And there he was, still living. Yes, he was writing to the letter complaining about the drains, something he would do. He was a very purposeful man. He was a very practical man. He liked diagnosing. He was known as being rather brusque and irascible. But as like I say in the book, if you'd been through Belsen, you maybe had a rather short attention span when, Mrs. Smith from number 47 is complaining about her bunions,
Yeah. But you can just imagine that he would sort of treat that as seriously as that. It's very moving when he goes around and he's examining your father-in-law as a young boy, and you really get the sense that that was a sliding door moment.
Absolutely.
If it hadn't have been him, like you said, would you have had your lovely wife? Would you have had your children? It's such a pivotal moment.
Yeah, the idea that the man who did that, who had that effect on my family, was also the man that achieved perhaps one of the greatest and yet little celebrated acts of the Second World War. What they did in Belsen was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely at the heart of it and driving it forward. So one of the great heroes.
Yeah, there's a lot of those in the book, but they're real. That's what I love about it. So I'm going to finish up now, but I just want to read this little piece at the end of the rightness of the cause and Britain's pivotal I can't say pivotal role. There can be no doubt. Some empires build concentration camps, and some build human laundries. And you know now what a human laundry was because Phil's told us. But it's just a brilliant book. And I think it's one that you could go back and revisit and find new moments in every time you go back to read it. So, I think most people will probably already have it.
Actually,
if you don't.
The passage you just read, I was very proud of it. I wanted to sum up how I felt about all of it. And I think it said some empires build it. Concentration camps, some built human laundries.
Yeah, it was great.
In the course of its rise and fall, the British Empire actually built both. But in the time of Douglas Peterkin, I think it's fair to remember it for the courage and and everything that lay behind the laundry, which goes back to India as well. When Timmy is making his choice of staying with Britain, or going with the Japanese.
Yeah, I think the real story you've told is just so impactful, because you tell it so honestly. So thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
And
taking the time. It's not, it's a good couple of days to read a book, and I really appreciate you plowing on.
Oh, well, it wasn't plowing. And you're coming to Australia, I believe, and I'm going to link to all your dates, your information for that down in the description box below. And also, what's the best place to buy your book? Would it be Amazon or?
Amazon in Australia, or Amazon anywhere, really.
Yeah, okay. So I'll link that as well. And so people can catch up with you when you come over to Oz, and you might be able to sign some copies.
I would love, there's nothing more pleasurable in being a writer than signing a copy. It's kind of what you do it for. Yes, you're right to be read.
Exactly. Well, congratulations, and I'll see you again. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much, Shauna. Bye.
Bye.